There was so much news at the end of last week, we were unable to bring you our discussion with former White House Chiefs of Staff Denis McDonough, who worked for President Obama, and Ken Duberstein from the Reagan White House. They, along with 15 others, are the subject of a new book by Chris Whipple called The Gatekeepers: How the White House Chiefs of Staff Define Every Presidency. We began by asking author Whipple why the job was so important.
Well, you know, it's critically important. One of the things I learned from talking to all the living White House chiefs is that presidents find out, often the hard way, that you cannot govern effectively without empowering a White House Chief of Staff as first among equals in the White House to, number one, to execute your agenda, number two, tell you things that you don't want to hear. Modern history shows the wreckage of presidencies that did not understand that lesson.
Ken, what does the person a president picks to be their chief of staff say about a president?
You say an awful lot about a president because it's the person who he spends the most time with other than his wife. He's the person who you're trusted to tell you things that you don't want to hear, as Chris said. You're the reality therapist. Everybody walks into the Oval Office and gets tongue-tied. They tell the president what they think the president wants to hear, not what he needs to know. The chief of staff has to tell him what he needs to know.
Ken, when you're chief of staff, do you kind of always have the president inside your head? Is that a part of the job? Or knowing the president's instincts, do you have to kind of intuit where the person is going who is the president?
Absolutely. You get to know the man. You get to know where he's going, what his goals are, what's acceptable. You know, on Reagan's case, he always would take 80% of what he wanted. Tip O'Neill used to say, I don't like compromising with Reagan because Reagan gets 80% of what he wants. And Reagan would turn to Jim Baker and to me and others and say, I'll take 80% every time, and I'll come back the next year for the additional 20. That's what governing is all about. Reagan understood that the far right and the far left, as he used to remind us, are professional bitchers. They don't want to be satisfied. That's how they get their money. That's how they get their members. So get what you can. Get that 80%. Figure out how to build a coalition that gets you that, and then keep moving. And don't worry about the far left or the far right.
Denis, you did something with President Obama called the wrap, the walk at the end of the day. What was that about, and what were those conversations like?
We used to just sit in the Oval and just go over what happened during the day and then what was teed up for the next day. I think it was kind of a nice springtime like this in D.C. He said, let's walk. And so, you know, sometimes a walk would be one lap. Sometimes it would be many more than one. Sometimes we'd be joined by others. But the point was to just have one moment to try to stop, get out of the kind of the rigmarole of the day, and take a look ahead at what more we needed to do, or what more we had hanging over for the next day.
Chris, the chief of staff is so powerful that does it ever come to be the case that they become a little too powerful for the president's own liking? Certainly that's been, President Trump has, people talked about Steve Bannon. Now, Steve Bannon is not the chief of staff, but there's been reporting about some tension between the president seeing Steve Bannon as the man behind the throne. Is this a problem or a potential problem?
Well, it's certainly been a problem with some White House chiefs. The far greater problem, in my mind, is when no one seems to be in charge, which may sound familiar at the moment. When you have 8 or 9 senior advisors, or even 4 or 5 with equal access to the Oval, no one is a gatekeeper, no one is in charge of the information flow, no one is in charge of executing policy, then you have what Jerry Ford used to call the spokes of the wheel, where nobody's in charge. It took Jerry Ford about a month to figure out that was a disaster.
Ken, in the current administration, you have a chief of staff. You have Steve Bannon, an advisor to the president who's quite powerful. And you have the president's daughter, who also has an important role. And then you have the president's son-in-law. That's at least 4 people with, I don't know whether you want to call it walk into the Oval Office privileges or seems to be on the same kind of power level. How do you evaluate that power structure in terms of the job that a chief of staff has to get done?
Well, going back to Chris's comment, the president needs to empower one person to be the White House chief of staff and the funnel rather than the spokes of the wheel. The person, and it's Reince Priebus, who has to be designated as first among equals. He is the person who may be the partner. It may be a partnership at the White House with lots of people, but he's the senior partner.
You know, Dick Cheney once told me that you can't have 8 or 9 guys sitting around with a very tough issue that you have to take to the president,
As Bill Clinton found out.
saying, "Hey,
Right.
it's your turn to tell him." No, it's your turn to. No, it's your turn to tell him. Somebody's got to be the guy who goes in with a piece of bad news.
You can have all the discussion you want, but then the door closes in the Oval Office and it's you and the president. You're the one who has to deliver that message. It ain't going to fly.
What's the worst message you had to deliver?
Oh, there were lots of them.
Dennis, how about you? Any that you felt like there was a gulp before you?
There is these things all the time. The worst was walking down the hallway to tell him that healthcare.gov wasn't going to work.
Yeah.
And it was particularly bad because he spent the entire previous year in monthly, then bi-weekly, then weekly meetings, concluding them by saying, now everybody understands that this only works if the website works, right? And everybody said, yeah, absolutely, Mr. President. So, yeah, that was preceded by a gulp.
Yeah, but you do that every day.
Yeah.
There's always something.
Skill set, Chris. So we've talked about it, the ability to say no, the ability to set up a system. What else does a chief of staff need?
You know, I don't know if you guys would agree, but I think temperament is a huge part of it. I think when you look at our present company, but especially at James Baker or Leon Panetta, these are grounded, sensible people who are comfortable in their own skin, who are not afraid to talk to the president and tell him what he needs to know. I think that's maybe an underrated thing. You know, they said about Leon Panetta that he was an iron fist inside a velvet glove. You don't have to be the pluperfect son of a bitch, as Haldeman was called. You can do it nicely as long as you enforce what you're trying to do.
And we'll be right back.